Hello and welcome to week 5 of business ethics. I'm sorry I haven't really been able to create personalized videos for this class for weeks 4 and 3. I'm hoping everybody is following along with the material. I'll know a little bit better when I take a look at your homework and your discussion blogs and your feedback forms. If it's necessary, we can go back and do a little bit of review, especially on the foundations of philosophical ethics. Last week we talked about stakeholders and managing stakeholder requests and needs. This time we're going to take a look at 3 special stakeholders. Right there on the tin, the title of the chapter, Chapter 4 in our business ethics textbook, is Society, the Environment, and Government. There are 3 sections to this chapter fitting the title. The first section is about business ethics and society. The second one is business ethics and the environment. And finally, how business and its ethics relate to government. So first we take a look at how, well, that's a bit frustrating. I mentioned before that there are a set of slides that come with the textbook for faculty use, and I thought I redid them to at least make them fit into the frame, but it looks like this one reverted. That's neither here nor there. First section, how businesses interact with the communities around them. Our textbook brings in the Japanese concept of nemawashi. I'm not sure if that is the actual appropriate way to pronounce it, but the concept matters more than the pronunciation, meaning laying the groundwork or building strong roots within your community instead of creating a bubble that is separate to the place in which your company has its home. So in 4.1, we learn about the very generic overviews of corporate law and corporate responsibility. By the end of this section, they want you to know these things. How do investors and owners benefit from doing business as a corporate entity? Defining concept of shareholder primacy, and discussing the conflict between shareholder primacy and corporate social responsibility. You'll remember we learned a lot about corporate social responsibility in the last chapter. You can take a look at it again, chapter 3, in which we have a framework for businesses self-regulating and implementing social and environmental responsibility within their own systems without necessarily pressure from the outside world. You've probably learned in other classes that corporations can incorporate, and in doing so, they become an entity that has limited liability. That means that no single person or team of persons will take on the actual debt of the corporation itself if you happen to be sued. So if the business fails at something, the individual people within the company have a limited liability as to the debts that they must legally repay. And here we have the central circle representing the corporation, and you can see how shareholders who nominate directors, who then hire officers, are all only partially overlapping this circle, representing the small sliver of liability that these individual entities will incur if they encounter problems down the road. And why should we have this sort of thing? Well, imagine if we didn't, and all of the board of directors, all of the shareholders, and all of the management we're each individually responsible if a business failed or a project failed and you were sued and lost. People wouldn't want to invest in that because there's inherent risk in any free enterprise that you partake in within your life. There's always a chance that things will fail or not go exactly the way that you planned. So in limiting risk with this limited liability, you encourage more growth, innovation, and development. That's the idea anyway. But this is a pretty big deal. This is a good privilege to have. So do corporations or other limited liability companies have anything that they owe in return for this ability that is given by the wider society? A lot of times in the Western world, in the United States and Western Europe and other English-speaking countries, we think a lot about rights. We think about individual rights to be left alone, to do what we want as long as we're not hurting other people, to vote, to speak. We often don't think about responsibilities, obligations. And that was talked about in Chapter 2 when you learned about the philosophical foundations of ethics. Just as a mini reminder, there are 3 major branches of philosophical ethics that are most influential today. One of them is virtue ethics, one of them is deontology, or the study of what we owe to one another, and one is consequentialism, focusing on the consequences of our actions. Through hundreds and even thousands of years of study, each of those pure theories don't seem to hold up to perfect scrutiny, but there are benefits and detriments to each when we consider what it means to be an ethical person or an ethical business person. When we are deciding something for ourselves or within our role in a company, we can think about the possible consequences of our actions. We can say, well, who's going to be affected by this and how are they going to be affected? Are any of those people or entities affected my stakeholders? What about shareholders? What about the employees within the company? You can also think about what would be the best course of action given everything you've observed up to now. This is sort of alluding to virtue ethics. You're developing your character over time by observation, practice, and then coming back and rationally reflecting upon it. So in all the things that you've seen in your lifetime, what have other people done in similar situations? Did it seem like it was the right thing to do? Why or why not? But then more relevant to us right now is the deontology. Deontics is just the ancient Greek word for duty, D-U-T-Y. So just by the fact that we live and thrive or don't thrive in an interdependent world, what do we owe to one another? A philosopher like Immanuel Kant would say we owe the respect of treating other beings and entities as ends in themselves. We don't use them for our own purposes. We have open communication with them because we want open communication in the other direction. We respect one another's ability to make their own goals. When it comes to corporations and the societies upon which they depend, they need that ability to have limited liability. They need the resources from their community, including natural resources and labor resources. So what do they give back in return? Free market thinkers like Milton Friedman, who has been mentioned numerous times in our textbook, think that giving back jobs, giving back goods or services that are needed or desired is enough. But other people say no, that the corporate entity and even smaller businesses are part of the social fabric, and in such they owe a responsibility to maintain and even improve the community around them. We get the definition of quid pro quo. Something is given to us and we owe something in return. That's down here. We looked at the whole stakeholder, several models of stakeholder in last week's materials, but another review here. The businesses, the corporations are all surrounded by their stakeholders, including the government, the environment, the community they're in, the employees of the company, the customers, the media, the supply chain. All of these entities have a vested interest in the operations of the business world. But again, in this chapter, we're going to focus on these ones: government, environment, and community. So first we think about how corporations affect the community in conjunction with the profit motive. We all know that businesses are created, at least in part, to create profit for the owners of the company and for stockholders. But I guess the big question is, how do we know what's best for the long-term interests of the company? A lot of free market capitalists focus on smaller and smaller slices of time within which we get caught up in this cycle where only the quarter of the year matters, and those numbers have to just keep going up and nothing else matters. The problem with that often is there is a lot of destruction that is enabled for all of our shareholders, all of our stakeholders, and even often for the business itself when we have only that kind of short-term mentality. That is the ultimate shareholder primacy, saying that the most important stakeholder at all times are the shareholders, and their needs and desires, for profit, are the ultimate thing and the only thing that takes priority number one. We can care about all the other stakeholders if and only if we deliver profits to our shareholders. And a lot of times in any social institution, but especially in business, the way that we interpret the law is often what will set the course of how businesses proceed, and that changes year by year, decade by decade, and century by century. And here we can trace the United States vision of shareholder primacy from this court case in 1919 all the way up until now. So you've probably heard of Henry Ford, who founded the Ford Automotive Company, and he was a little bit different than the big-time capitalists that were his peers. Ford was making a ton of profit, and he thought, well, let's look more long-term and let's create projects to make ourselves a little bit more sustainable. If you look on the pages, let's see here. Ford had announced that his company would stop paying big dividends to shareholders and instead would use its profits to achieve several other goals, including improving product quality, expanding company facilities, and most surprisingly, lowering prices. And the courts actually ruled against him. They said you can't do any of this if it diminishes shareholder profits. And you can see the problem there. He wanted to improve the product so he can insist on, or contribute to, continuing to hold market share in the future. If you expand your company facilities, logically, that is a step toward expanding your reach and power within your market. So the long term and the short term come to conflict again. But at this time in the early 1900s, the courts very much said that the shareholders win out over everything else. That it's illegal and maybe even immoral to have a business focusing on other things, which to our contemporary ears sounds a little bit crazy. Oddly enough, and kind of contradictory, in that same court decision, this is the Michigan Supreme Court, they also upheld the validity, this is reading straight from the book, of the doctrine known as the business judgment rule, a common law principle stating that officers, directors, managers of a corporation are not liable for losses incurred when the evidence demonstrates that the decisions were reasonable and made in good faith, which gives corporate management latitude in deciding how to run a company. So, okay, this means the team of managers can decide how to run their own business with little interference from the courts or other outside forces. Yet, they still have to make sure that profit is their number one goal in every situation and every context. This is one way we can demonstrate that the law is never forever. It's constantly being updated with precedent and new challenges as we try and hone things to match how we want society to go. But then there were changes. We jump all the way to 1968. I don't know, I can't remember nope, they don't talk about it here yet. We jump all the way to 1968 in another case, the case of, let's see here, Schlensky versus Wrigley. And this is the Wrigley you might have heard of, Wrigley Field in Chicago and Wrigley's Gum. And they decided that they were going to sort of ignore this idea of shareholder primacy, at least in one instance. And that's the instance of not putting in super high energy bright lights around Chicago Stadium, baseball stadium, because everybody in the community thought it would be a terrible thing. It would decrease the quality of life for people who lived near the stadium. It would attract more lowlifes, which is a terrible, but you know, it's a terrible way to judge somebody. But crime, it would make the area a lot less comfortable to live in. So of course the shareholders sued the Wrigley company and said, hey, you're diminishing our profits by not enabling night games to come to Chicago. And there was a shift that they actually won. Wrigley actually won and said, okay, there's other concerns that businesses need to have than just shareholder value straight down the line no matter what. So even though we had to jump 50 years ahead, we can see that the changing values of society helped to change the way that business gets done in the United States. And I think I'm going to end video number 1 here. I never like to make them more than 20 minutes or so everybody can take some time, think about this stuff, and then come back to part 2 on their own time. So I will see you there in part 2.